Hi, I'm responding to the Lizard Lass. She did a video entitled Tongues, a Specific Secret Divine Language or a Synonym for All Languages, which is actually responding to another video. In the video you stated that you were an atheist and that you were raised Anglican and that you thought it made more sense if speaking in tongues referred to a real language, and you gave a scenario of where it made more sense if a missionary goes to a foreign country, speaks in tongues to speak in the language of that country, speaks in a language supernaturally to speak to the people of that country, rather than speaking in a language that nobody understands. And you address the issue of people thinking, of Christians that think that speaking in tongues refers to a kind of code language between them and God that nobody else can understand. So that's kind of a summary of I think, of what you were saying. And you posted the video in February, and you said that you would be excited to get your first video response. I don't know if this is the first or not. Sorry I didn't dig around your channel to find out. But since you said that, I thought I'd post a video specifically about it. I made a comment on your webpage there. Well, first of all, I just want to, I know you're an atheist, but just, you're curious, so I thought I'd clear up where the understanding about what speaking in tongues is, what the differences are, and address some of the issues you raised. Speaking in tongues, there's several instances of it throughout history. Of course, in Acts chapter 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 14 mentions speaking in tongues. In Acts chapter 2, the apostles and probably all of those in the upper room spoke in tongues and made a lot of noise. Some people came and saw them, these guys from Galilee, these people and women, I guess, from at least one of them was a woman, speaking in tongues in languages that they could not understand, and it sounded like gibberish to them. For some reason, they thought these people might be drunk with new wine, and then some other people present said, "How we hear them speaking in our languages?" They were Jews, but Jews lived all over the empire, and they were from at least 16 different language groups, and they could understand the languages that were being spoken in tongues. Okay, so there's an example of speaking in tongues, and whether through a miracle of the ear or through the miracle of what the language that was spoken was, they could hear the people speaking in tongues, speaking in their own languages. Then you go to 1 Corinthians 14, and the speaking in tongues is in a different situation. Paul says about speaking in tongues in the church there, he says that if someone speaks in tongues, no one understands him. So he instructed that there be an interpreter, and that the message or the words that are spoken in tongues be interpreted so the congregation could understand. Now, speaking in tongues became very, there are many instances of speaking in tongues throughout history, usually kind of isolated incidences. There's some groups in the 1800s that said they spoke in tongues. There's a group in England and Europe in the 1830s. There's some groups in various parts of the United States, the 1870s, 1880s. But it became very, there's a widespread outbreak of it and other gifts of the Holy Spirit in around 1901, and then 1904 through 1906. There was the Topeka, Kansas revival in a Bible school there in Topeka, Kansas. The first one to speak in tongues there was named Agnes Osmond. Now, according to a newspaper article from Kansas that she had, the guy who wrote the newspaper article recorded it this. And my experience with newspaper people is, if it's 50% accurate, that's okay, but it's what we have. So anyway, it was recorded that at least that she said, or somebody said, that she went into a restaurant. She was speaking in tongues for days and days, and she went into a restaurant and she spoke in German to the German shopkeeper there by speaking in tongues. So anyway, that was the belief at that time, was that speaking in tongues was a real language. And at Azusa Street, as far as I understand, the belief was that that tongue means language, and that speaking in tongues was some kind of a real language. And there are many accounts from the Azusa Street revival, revival that is known as kind of the birthplace of Pentecostalism, which is groups of Christians that believe in speaking in tongues, healing, prophecy, and various other gifts of the Spirit that they're active for today. Now, healing, many groups believed in healing before the Azusa Street outpouring, but anyway, that's just some of the beliefs of the Pentecostal movement, and many denominations grew out of that. After that, in the 1960s, you had the Charismatic movement, and actually that affected the Anglican Church. There are Anglican churches that believed in speaking in tongues and other gifts. Roman Catholic Church, Methodist churches, various other groups. So just to give you a little history, that's 1960s. Azusa Street and the Pentecostal movement started around the turn of the century, around 1904, 1906, or 1901, depending on how you determine the history. Now, the beliefs, though, originally, as far as I know, is that tongues were a language. Now, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, he's talking about the importance of love, and he says, though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, etc., etc. And then he talks about giving his body to be burned, having faith to move all mountains, and if he doesn't have love, that he's nothing, it profits him nothing. So in that passage, Paul suggests the idea that speaking in tongues may be in the tongues of men or of angels. So many Pentecostals will say speaking in tongues may be in a human language, but it could also be in an angelic language. Now, there are some charismatics and maybe some Pentecostals from that movement in the 60s who think of speaking in tongues as some sort of language between you and God only. There are some people who think that. I don't know what the percentages are one way or another, but historically in the Pentecostal movement, the original or the early belief was that speaking in tongues was speaking in a language. So I just thought I'd mention that to you. Not every individual in the movement had the same beliefs or has the same beliefs about speaking in tongues, and there's a variety of beliefs. Experientially, when somebody speaks in tongues, they don't understand what they're saying anyway, and they speak in tongues unless they also get the interpretation. From the people I've talked with who've gotten interpretations, they either get a few words of it and it comes to them as they speak it out, or they get a lot of it kind of downloaded to them and then they speak it out. In some cases, one person speaks in tongues in the congregation. Now, in my experience, this usually happened kind of between songs when there's sort of a lull there. Somebody speaks out in tongues or speaks a prophecy, and then someone else will give the interpretation of the tongue. And now I've had some friends that I knew pretty well, and I believe they're telling the truth, that would get the interpretation of the tongue, not speak it out yet, or they got it, one of them got it, he didn't know what it was, he got these words, you know. Then somebody else in the church spoke the same thing out, the same message in tongues. That sort of thing happens. And you know, it's just kind of like when a Christian goes to one church and gets a prophecy from somebody, you go to another church, totally different group of people, they don't know the other people, they don't know that they know you, and they give you the same prophecy or many of the main points. I've had that happen to me before too. Seen that happen with my brother, you know, that people prophesied the same thing over him in one state and then in another state of the United States. So anyway, these are some of the concerns. Let's see, was there anything else you were wondering about speaking in tongues? As far as speaking in tongues, going to a foreign country and preaching the gospel in that language, we don't really have a clear example of that in the Bible. In the Bible, in Acts chapter 2, the people that were the saints, the disciples that were speaking in tongues, were speaking about the wonderful works of God. It doesn't necessarily say they were preaching, you know, specific like Kergama about Christ, the doctrine of Christ, the resurrection. They may have been saying psalms. They may have been praising God. They might have been preaching the gospel. We don't know. They're talking about the wonderful works of God. They may have been saying God's works are so wonderful. We don't know. But what we do know is that Peter stood up and addressed the crowd and preached, apparently in a common language that they could all understand. It may have been Aramaic, or that most can understand, or whatever. It may have been Aramaic or Hebrew, whatever they spoke locally. There's a debate about which one was more prominent, I suppose. If it was Jerusalem, it may have been Aramaic, or it may have been Greek, especially since there's so many foreigners there for the Feast of Pentecost, commemorating the giving of the law. Anyway, so the idea of going to a foreign country and preaching in tongues, I've heard of it happening, and there's actually a book, Spoken by the Spirit, and that has a colon and something else. It's by Paul Harris. You can download it online. There's a website I had downloaded at one point. It gives 70 accounts of people, testimonies of people who spoke in tongues and other people understood, or people who understood speaking in tongues. Now, if you do a little research on some of the accounts of Azusa Street, I've read several accounts of that happening at Azusa Street, where someone present in the meeting understood a message spoken out in tongues, or someone speaking in tongues. They overheard it. And so the book I mentioned actually had a lot of testimonies from the Assemblies of God denomination, and I think some of them were from the Charismatic Catholic movement, where somebody understood. And it was written around 1971, so there's some dated examples. You probably couldn't trace those down if you really wanted to interview the people, if you're that motivated. Yeah. So there've been, and I've heard many other. You know, I've heard some. I think someone that my parents knew had experienced that as overhearing a language and speaking in tongues that he understood. I believe it was him. Anyway, so yeah, that's some of the just a perspective on speaking in tongues. I think historically Pentecostals, at least that group of people who speak in tongues, the historical belief of that movement is that speaking in tongues is a language, but the Bible talks about speaking in tongues of men or of angels, and that the movement, most people in the movement who study that passage would allow for either type of speaking in tongues. Yes, it could be a language that's not a human language, or it could be a human language. And hey, you know, not everything is genuine. You know, there could be gibberish, could be some psychological kind of thing, and it could be from some other spirit that's not the spirit of God. If it's, you know, there are other religions that speak in tongues, and so yeah. Anyway, there's a perspective on speaking in tongues. I hope that you know, that you like getting a response to your video, and thanks for watching mine. You can watch my series on speaking in tongues. I've got a couple of them on my channel. Thanks.